An elderly man stood at the counter, and the voice of a young bank employee, full of disdain, broke the silence of the luxurious space. His gaze swept from head to toe over the elderly man who stood before the counter, dressed in shabby clothes and carrying an old, heavy sack. It was clear he looked down on him. "The bank isn't a place for people like you to cause trouble. Go somewhere else," he said. The elderly man, around 83 years old, wore torn clothes, plastic sandals, and carried a heavy, worn-out sack. His gaze remained unwavering, and his voice was slow but patient. "I'm here to deposit money. My money is in this bag," he said. The bank employee raised an eyebrow, a mocking laugh escaping him. He pointed at the sack with one finger, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Money in the sack? It's probably just a bunch of small change, isn't it? We don't have time to deal with that. Go home." The elderly man remained calm. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled the heavy sack across the long distance, but his voice remained gentle, as if trying to endure. "This is the money I've earned with my sweat, saved over a lifetime. I want to deposit it for the future." The employee turned away, unable to hide his derisive laugh, drawing the attention of several colleagues nearby. One of them muttered, loud enough for the elderly man to hear, "The bank has to handle these old, torn sacks full of small change? What a waste of time." In the modern, shiny atmosphere of the bank, the elderly man seemed out of place. The transparent glass counters, the lights reflecting from the overhead bulbs, created a sense of luxury. The bank employees, dressed in suits, busily attended to well-dressed customers. The automatic doors opened, and everyone instinctively turned their heads when they heard the sound of the elderly man's sack dragging across the tile floor. The sack was so heavy that it forced him to bend down with each step, moving slowly but resolutely. When he reached the counter, the elderly man stopped and carefully placed the sack on the ground. His eyes scanned the space around him, as if to make sure he had arrived at the right place. But it was his ragged appearance, his small frame, and his torn plastic sandals that drew all the looks, not out of curiosity, but out of disdain and discomfort. A few customers in suits and evening gowns couldn't hide their judgmental glances. A middle-aged woman, adorned with glittering jewelry, whispered to the man beside her, "This bank even lets people like him in? What happened to the standards?" The elderly man ignored the whispers and kept his focus on the bank employee in front of him, waiting for help. But all he received was cold indifference and blunt rejection. "What a waste of time. You should take that sack home." "We don't have time to handle this," the employee repeated, his tone firmer this time, as if to emphasize that the elderly man didn't deserve to be served there. The elderly man didn't say anything further, just bent down to lift the heavy sack. His eyes showed a hint of sadness, but his calmness remained intact. The bank employee straightened up behind the counter, arms crossed, his gaze filled with annoyance. He stared at the sack, then mocked, "We don't handle small change here. You should take that home. Don't bother coming here again." The elderly man said nothing, only lowered the heavy sack with his rough hands. His voice was still calm, not a hint of anger in it. "This is the money I've saved my whole life. I want to deposit it so I can live peacefully in the future. If you won't accept it, I'll wait for someone more qualified." The employee snorted and turned to his colleague beside him, speaking in a mocking tone. "He wants to speak to someone in charge. As if we have time to sit here and count change all day." Both of them laughed dismissively. The atmosphere around the counter grew tense. Nearby customers began whispering louder. A well-dressed middle-aged man glanced at the elderly man and shook his head. "What a nuisance. How did this bank allow someone like him in?" A young woman who had just finished signing papers glanced at the elderly man with disdain before turning to her friend. "What a waste of time. We're busy, not here to watch this." Suddenly, from inside the office, a middle-aged man in a suit walked out. He was the branch manager, his face serious. He walked straight to the counter, his eyes scanning the elderly man and the heavy sack on the floor. "Is there a problem here?" His voice rang out, causing the room to fall silent. The employee quickly straightened up and nodded at the manager, explaining, "Oh, it's nothing serious." This elderly man brought in a sack of small change to deposit, but we don't think it's worth the time to handle it. The manager nodded, his gaze still unfriendly as he looked at the elderly man. He stepped closer, glanced at the sack one more time, and spoke with a calm yet contemptuous tone. "I'm sorry, but we cannot process this money. You're just wasting our time and the customer's time." The elderly man looked directly into the manager's eyes, his gaze not angry, but filled with sadness. His voice was still slow and calm. "You can tell your superior that I'm willing to wait." The manager furrowed his brow, clearly unwilling to argue further. He turned to the nearby security guard and signaled, "Please escort him out. We can't let this interfere with the bank's operations." The large security guard approached the elderly man. His voice was lower now, more subdued. "Sir, if you don't have anything urgent, please leave. You've been standing here too long, and it's making things uncomfortable for everyone." The elderly man stood still, looking around at the customers at the counter and in the waiting area. Most of them avoided his gaze, and a few looked uncomfortable, turning their heads away. None of them spoke up to defend him. The elderly man slowly bent down and lifted the heavy sack with his trembling hands. His shoulders hunched slightly under the weight, but his steps were still slow and determined. He didn't argue, didn't show anger or resistance. The atmosphere in the bank returned to its usual bustle, but the memory of what had just happened lingered. Some people, especially a young employee nearby, couldn't help but feel uneasy, watching the frail figure of the elderly man as he left. A young employee sitting at a nearby counter had observed the entire scene. He was new to the job, his face still youthful and his eyes filled with enthusiasm. Seeing the elderly man treated unfairly, he couldn't hide his discomfort. "He came here to deposit money," he said, his voice soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "We should have served him. We should have checked before rejecting him." His words made the atmosphere freeze for a moment. The employee who had mocked the elderly man immediately turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "You're so naive. Do you really think he has any money worth depositing? That sack is probably all just loose change. It would take longer to count than it's worth." The colleagues around them snickered at the mockery, but the young employee didn't flinch. He stood up and walked directly to the elderly man, gently asking, "Sir, may I check your bag?" The elderly man looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes, but he nodded in agreement. He lowered the sack to the floor. Several employees watched with annoyance as the young employee carefully opened the knots on the sack. As the old fabric was peeled away, a sight emerged that surprised everyone present. Inside were dozens of neatly stacked bundles of small change, carefully tied up. The entire counter fell silent. The mocking laughter was replaced by stunned silence, and all that remained were the astonished eyes of those who had been laughing just moments before. Amidst the confusion of the bank staff, a colleague standing nearby muttered, "Is this all loose change?" The young staff member carefully placed each stack of money on the counter, then turned to the old man and asked, "Sir, how long have you been saving this money?" The old man replied gently, his voice calm but full of pride, "This is all the money I earned from selling lottery tickets, collecting recyclables, and working odd jobs over the years. I saved every penny." Those standing nearby, including both staff and customers, were stunned when they heard this answer. The feeling of embarrassment began to appear on the faces of those who had mocked the old man earlier. The young staff member stood silently, looking at the stacks of money. Although it was loose change, the sheer quantity was enough to make it clear that this was no small sum. He picked up one stack, his hand trembling, and turned to look at the manager, who was standing a few steps away, with a confused expression. "Sir, this is not a small amount. We need to process it right away," he said. At this moment, the manager was speechless, standing frozen. His gaze swept over the stacks of money on the counter and then paused on the old man's calm face. The atmosphere in the bank seemed to freeze entirely, leaving only the stunned silence of everyone present. The bill-counting machine at the counter started clicking as the young staff member carefully placed each stack of loose change into the machine. The amount on the screen steadily increased, from a few million to tens of millions, and then surpassed what everyone had imagined. The air in the bank seemed to freeze as the staff who had mocked the old man now stood still, their eyes glued to the screen. The number on the machine continued to climb until it surpassed 1 billion VND. The young staff member paused, letting out a breath as if to regain his composure. He turned to the old man and said, his voice filled with awe but respect, "Sir, the amount in this bag is very large. I'm still counting, but it may take a little more time to process." The old man nodded gently, his expression not one of arrogance or surprise. To him, the money was simply the result of a lifetime of hard work, and he never expected it to cause such shock. The bill-counting machine clicked again as the stacks of loose change were passed through, and the final total displayed on the screen made everyone in the room hold their breath: 3,217,000,000 VND. The young staff member spoke again, his voice full of respect as he turned to the manager. "Sir, this amount is very large and completely legal. We need to process it immediately." His words were like a slap to the staff and customers who had mocked the old man. A nearby staff member stammered, 3.2 billion? How could this old man have saved such a large sum? The manager, who had previously shown disdain, was now standing frozen. His gaze flickered over the stacks of money and then rested on the old man. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his authority, but the embarrassment was clear in his eyes. "Yes, we will process this money immediately. We apologize for the inconvenience caused to you," he said, trying to salvage the situation. The old man remained silent, his gaze not one of reproach, but of calm resignation, as if to say that he had grown used to such treatment throughout his life. A middle-aged customer, who had previously looked down on the old man, now sat silently, pondering. He muttered to his companion, 3.2 billion? How could this man have saved that much money? I guess we misjudged him. The young staff member continued processing the paperwork to open the old man's savings account. He was silently impressed by the old man's patience and composure. Despite the small denominations, each of those coins carried with it a story of years of hard work and perseverance that not everyone could understand. As the paperwork neared completion, the young staff member turned to the old man, his voice filled with respect. "Sir, your money has been counted and recorded. Would you like to deposit it all into a savings account, or would you prefer to keep a portion for yourself?" The old man smiled gently and said, "Deposit it all for me. I don't need much. I just want a safe place for this money. Thank you, my boy." His simple yet meaningful words made many people in the room lower their heads. The disdainful glances and attitudes that had been present earlier had disappeared, replaced by an awkward silence and respect. The manager, standing nearby, clenched his lips, unable to say anything. He nodded to the young staff member, signaling for him to continue, but inside, he felt ashamed of his earlier behavior. Those nearby, both staff and customers, quietly watched the old man as if he had just taught them an important lesson they would never forget. After the counting was complete, the young staff member politely handed the transaction receipt to the old man. The atmosphere in the bank was strangely quiet, with no one daring to speak. But a wealthy customer, dressed in an expensive suit, couldn't contain his curiosity and approached the old man. "Sir, how did you manage to save so much money?" he asked. "I truly didn't expect this." The old man looked up, his eyes gentle and filled with calm. He smiled softly and said in a slow, warm voice, "It's nothing special, my boy. I've been selling lottery tickets and collecting recyclables for decades. Every penny I earned came from hard work, sweat, and tears, from rainy days to scorching hot ones. I didn't spend much, just saved each little coin, so I would have a safe amount for my old age. Because I know that no one will look after me better than myself." His sincere words were like a refreshing breeze blowing through the suffocating room. Everyone in the bank, staff and customers alike, could not hide their astonishment and emotion. A young woman nearby silently lowered her head. She had once mocked the old man, calling him a lazy beggar, but now those words made her feel deeply ashamed. Another bank employee, who had previously ridiculed the old man, now couldn't look up. He awkwardly turned to his colleague, sighing softly, "We were wrong. I never thought he could save such a fortune, living in such a frugal way." The young staff member, the only one who had stood up for the old man earlier, clutched the receipt tightly in his hand before respectfully handing it over to the old man. He bowed his head and said, "Sir, I truly admire you, not just because of the money, but because of your patience and resilience. Thank you for teaching us all a great lesson." The old man nodded gently, his cloudy eyes glimmering with a kind smile. "It's nothing, my boy. Everyone will face difficulties in life. I just hope that everyone respects one another, no matter what they look like." His story quickly spread throughout the room. Some customers who had been gossiping and sneering before now sat in silence, looking at the old man with respectful eyes. One of them even walked over, gently bowed, and said, "Sir, you've made me rethink a lot of things. Thank you for sharing your story." The bank manager stood motionless in the back, feeling the overwhelming shame within himself. He didn't dare look directly at the old man, but instead bowed deeply and said in a choked voice, We apologize for not respecting you from the start. I promise that our bank will never allow something like this to happen again." Although his apology was sincere, it could not erase the feelings of guilt among all those who had mocked the old man earlier. However, the old man did not scold or express anger.